The quiet question, the studio lights burned hot and heavy on Sundar Pichai's face. He sat very still, hands folded on his lap, trying not to let the sweat bead too quickly at his hairline. The live audience was silent now, and the host, a young woman with sharp eyes and the softer voice, leaned forward in her chair. "So Sundar," she said, "before we move on to the next topic, I have to ask. What you said last month about the new Pope Robert Prevost has really stirred people. You called him the most quietly dangerous man in the world. Can you explain what you meant?" A ripple of laughter passed through the crowd, but Sundar did not smile. He looked down at his hands, then back up into the bright white camera light. "I didn't mean it as an insult," he said, his voice soft. "But people should understand what happens when power wears a humble face." The host blinked, her pen tapping against her knee. "That is a strange thing to say." Sundar sighed, and for a moment, everyone thought he might stop talking. But then he began, slowly, to tell a story no one expected. "You see," he said, "5 years ago I got a letter from him." Even the cameraman froze. Sundar never told anyone about the letter. He remembered the day it arrived, clearly like a film in his mind. It was a windy morning in Mountain View, and he was sitting in his office, already buried under papers and schedules. The envelope was simple, cream-colored, with his name written in unfamiliar hand. Inside, there were only 2 sentences. "We will meet soon. The choice you make will change more lives than you imagine. Until then, walk softly." Was unsigned, but on the back was a faint red seal 2 keys crossed beneath a crown. Sundar didn't need anyone to tell him what it meant. Even a boy who grew up in Chennai could recognize the papal seal. He didn't sleep well that week. He asked his assistant to quietly look into it. Was this a prank? But no one could. Trace the letter. No fingerprints. No camera footage. No mailroom record. 2 months later. He was in Rome for an entirely unrelated business summit when a quiet man in a black suit approached him in the lobby of his hotel. "Mr. Pichai?" The man said, bowing slightly. His holiness would like a word. "If you can spare a moment?" At first, Sundar thought he meant Pope Francis. Of course, that made sense. Sundar had met many heads of state before, so he nodded, even though his stomach tightened. They walked through narrow hallways, out a back entrance, and into a small courtyard filled with the smell of jasmine. The man led him into a tiny chapel, empty except for one figure at the altar. The man turned to Sundar, gave a slight nod, and closed the door behind him. The figure at the altar turned around slowly. He was young, at least younger than Sundar. Expected maybe mid-50s, with a plain black cassock and sharp, kind eyes. He smiled faintly, as though they were old friends. "Thank you for coming," he said. "You are Sundar?" "Yes." "Yes," Sundar said, trying to keep his voice calm. "But forgive me, you are not Pope Francis." The man shook his head. "No," he said. "My name is Robert Prevost. You do not know me yet, but you will." In the studio, Sundar paused his story. The host was staring at him now, wide-eyed. The audience leaned forward. Even the teleprompter operator forgot to press the next line. Sundar's fingers tightened on his knee. "He told me that day," he continued, "that something was coming. Something I would be forced to decide. He said that the decision would not just affect me or even the company, but millions of people who would never even know my name." The host swallowed, her voice softer now. "And what decision was that?" Sundar took a long breath. "He didn't say," Sundar admitted. "But he asked me one question before I left that day, and I still don't know what to do with it." "What was the question?" The host asked back in that small Roman chapel. Robert Prevost had stepped closer, his eyes locked on Sundar's. His voice was quiet, but it cut through the silence like a bell. "If you could choose between being respected by the world," he asked, "or being kind to it, what would you choose?" The host sat back in her chair. Stunned. The audience murmured. And Sundar, staring into the camera now, added, "He told me that one day soon I would not have the luxury of both." What Sundar didn't say, not yet, was what happened after. He left that chapel, because as he walked back into the courtyard. The man in the black suit waiting for him handed him another envelope. This one was heavier. It had no seal. Inside was a single photograph dot, and the photograph was a woman Sundar had never seen before. But in her arms, she held a baby. And on the back of the photo, written in the same hand as the first letter, were the words, "She will. Pay the price if you choose wrong." In the studio, the host leaned in, almost whispering now. "What did you do after that?" That Sundar's jaw tightened. And he said only, "I tried to forget. But the harder I tried, the more impossible it became." But what no one knew, what Sundar had never told anyone, even his closest advisors, was that 3 months later, he saw the woman from the photo, not in Rome, not in Chennai, but in New York City. She was standing on a street corner, waiting for the light to change, holding the same baby in her arms. And she was crying. The host's pen fell from her hand. The studio fell silent. "What happened then?" she asked Sundar. Looked down at his shoes, then back at the camera, and very quietly he said, someone else was watching her. On the screen behind him, the producers suddenly flashed a breaking news headline. Vatican announces Pope Francis to step down. Cardinal Robert Prevost chosen as next pope. The audience gasped. The host turned, confused, then back at Sundar. "Did you know?" she asked. But Sundar only closed his eyes for a long moment. When he opened them again, he whispered, "I warned you." And somewhere, thousands of miles away, in a darkened room beneath the Vatican, a man in white robes smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "He remembers." Asterisk, the shadow and the choices, silence in the studio seemed to stretch endlessly, as if the entire world was holding its breath. The breaking news headline still glowed red on the screen behind Sundar. Its words like fire in the quiet. Vatican announces Pope Francis to step down. Cardinal Robert Prevost chosen as next pope. The host had stopped speaking. Her fingers, now pale and trembling slightly, pressed into her notes as though she were trying to keep herself grounded. The audience didn't move. Not one cough, not even a shuffle of shoes. Sundar just sat there, staring into the lights, his lips pressed into a thin line. His dark eyes, usually warm and reserved, now held something much heavier, something ancient, as though he carried a weight no man should ever have to bear. At last, she dared to break the silence. Her voice was low and careful now, more like someone speaking to a wounded animal than a CEO. "You warned us? You said something was coming. You said he asked you to choose. Are you saying that choice is here now?" Sundar didn't answer right away. Instead, he closed his eyes, and for the first time that evening, he allowed himself to remember everything. Not just the chapel, not just the woman and the baby, but what came after. The pieces he'd never shared, the parts he'd hidden even from himself. It had been 2 weeks since that day in Rome when he saw the woman again. He'd been in New York for a board meeting, surrounded by the usual noise, taxis blaring, people shouting into phones, the rumble of trucks. He had stopped at a crosswalk near Bryant Park, lost in thought. When he noticed her on the opposite corner. It wasn't just her face that startled him. It was the way she looked at him, as if she knew exactly who he was, exactly what he'd been asked to do. Her eyes, rimmed red from crying, locked onto his, and in that instant the noise of the city fell away. There was no more traffic, no more shouting, only the sound of her baby fussing quietly in her arms. And the two of them staring at each other across the street like unwilling conspirators. But before Sundar could move, before he could even lift his hand, he saw him. A man in a long black coat, tall and faceless in the winter light, standing just behind her. At first, Sundar thought he was a stranger passing by. But then the man's hand, gloved and slow, reached out, just barely brushing the strap of her diaper bag. And Sundar saw the faint glint of something metallic beneath the coat. In that frozen moment, Sundar felt it again, that quiet, sick certainty. From the chapel, the choice was coming. And someone, her perhaps, would pay if he chose wrong. Back in the studio, he opened his eyes again. The host's question still hung in the air. "Are you saying that choice is here now?" He took a deep breath before answering. "It was never about me," he said finally. "Not really. It was about what kind of man I would be when no one was watching. The host swallowed hard. What did he want from you? That question brought him back to the second letter. The night after seeing the woman in New York, he'd returned to his hotel room, unsettled, but trying to convince himself it was nothing. Just a coincidence. Just his imagination. But there, lying on the pillow as though it had always been waiting for him, was another envelope. No seal. No stamp. Just his name written in the same careful script. His hands trembled as he opened it. Dot inside. There were 2 sheets of paper this time. The first was blank, except for one line written at the top. If you choose to stand tall, she falls. If you choose to kneel, the world will never know what you've done. The second sheet was a list of names. At least 100 names, nearly. Typed. Sundar didn't recognize a single one of them. But at the bottom of the page, in smaller writing, was another line. These are the ones you'll save. If you're willing to lose yourself. In the studio, Sundar's voice grew softer as he spoke. He asked me to give up something I wasn't sure I could live without, he said. To quietly erase myself from the future we'd built. To step away. To let the world believe I was weak or foolish or unfit. To let them tear me apart without ever explaining why. The host's brow furrowed. But why? What was the point of all this? Sundar turned his gaze toward her at last, and his eyes, though tired, burned with something fierce. Because, he said quietly, sometimes the only way to protect the ones who cannot speak is to let yourself become the villain. The host sat back, visibly shaken. The audience was still silent. Somewhere in the control room, a producer whispered urgently into a headset. But no one on stage noticed. Then, just as the host opened her mouth to speak again, Sundar continued. And what he said next sent a visible shiver through the room. He showed me photographs. Sundar said, his voice breaking for the first time, not just the woman and her baby, but others, families, children, entire villages. People I've never met who don't know who I am, who may never even hear my name. And he told me if I made the wrong choice, the quiet machines we built would crush them all, and no one would ever know it happened. No one would even believe it. The host stared at him, horrified. What machines? She whispered. Sundar shook his head. You already use them every day, he said simply. But if I told you the truth now, you'd never trust them again. You'd never trust me. He paused then, long enough for the host to gather herself. But before she could form another question, the screen behind them flickered again, and another headline appeared. This one even more startling than the first. Exclusive. Private Vatican letter surfaces. New Pope allegedly influenced by. Silicon Valley leaders. Host spun around, her face pale. Did you have something to do with this? She asked, her voice shaking now, but Sundar didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a final envelope. He set it on the table between them. This, he said quietly, is the last thing you sent me. The host stared at it. Her hands hovered over it, hesitant, as though she could feel the weight of it even without touching it. At last, she picked it up, broke the seal, and unfolded the single page inside. Her eyes widened, her lips parted, and though the audience couldn't see what was written there, her hands began to tremble as she whispered aloud, You have until midnight. Choose. Sundar sat back, closing his eyes. The cameras stayed on him. And somewhere far away, deep in the quiet stone halls of the Vatican, a figure in white sat alone in a darkened room, fingers steepled. Eyes gleaming in the candlelight. He murmured to himself, soft enough that no one else could hear, but the words were clear and cold, and the hour has come. Just then, in the studio, the lights flickered, just for an instant, and the sound of faint static filled the air. The host dropped the letter. Sundar's head snapped up, and on the giant screen behind them, a live image appeared. The woman from the photograph. Standing alone in a dimly lit room. And behind her, the man in the black coat, his hand resting on her shoulder. Sundar's breath caught in his throat. The audience gasped. The camera zoomed in on his face. just as the man in black leaned closer to the woman and whispered something in her ear, and she turned slowly, with tears streaming down her face, and stared directly into the camera. "Sundar," she said, her voice faint but sharp enough to cut through the static. "It's time." Asterisk, the quiet rebellion. Studio air had grown thick, as though everyone in the room was breathing through water. Even the camera seemed to hesitate, their lenses straining to capture every subtle movement. The woman on the screen, her tear-streaked face glowing faintly against the dark background, kept staring straight into Sundar's eyes, as if no one else in the world existed. And still, the man in the black coat loomed behind her, his gloved hand resting firmly on her shoulder. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His presence was enough to chill Sundar's bones. Even across thousands of miles, the host sat frozen, one hand still gripping the envelope that had dropped from her lap, her knuckles white, her breath shallow. Then the woman spoke again. "Sundar," she said, her voice quiet yet full of something sharp, a strange mix of fear and defiance. "They know. They've always known. And now, it's you or me." Her words echoed through the studio, bouncing off the walls and settling heavily on Sundar's shoulders. For the first time in his life, he felt something he couldn't explain, not just fear or guilt, but a kind of bitter clarity. The choice was here now, inescapable, staring at him through the screen with tearful eyes. He stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor. "Cut the feed," he said to the crew. His voice low but firm. No one moved. "I said." He repeated, louder this time, "Cut the feed, now." But before the screen could go dark, the man in the black coat finally moved. He leaned closer to the woman, whispered something inaudible into her ear, and then, very deliberately, he raised his other hand, holding a thin silver knife. Audience gasped as the blade caught the light. Gleaming like ice. Sundar felt his stomach twist violently. And for a brief second, he saw himself, not as the man who built empires, not as the CEO everyone admired, but as a boy again, standing barefoot in the dusty streets of Chennai, watching a stray dog corner a child half his size. He remembered how his heart had pounded, how his knees had locked, how every cell in his body screamed at him to run. But he hadn't. He'd stepped forward then. He hadn't known why. And now, as the woman's eyes silently begged him for something, a sign, a word, a miracle, he felt the same old instinct rise again, raw and undeniable. He couldn't sit still anymore. The host finally found her voice, though it trembled. "Sundar, what are you doing?" she asked. He didn't answer. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, black device, barely the size of his palm, almost unnoticeable. The audience couldn't see it clearly, but the host recognized it at once. A personal security beacon, the kind reserved only for the highest levels of government. The kind that could summon help or destruction in minutes, but Sundar didn't press it. Instead, he set it down on the table in front of him, staring at it as though it might bite. "I swore I'd never use it," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "But they left me no choice." The host leaned in, her eyes darting. Between him and the screen, what is that thing? What does it do? He met her gaze, and though his voice was calm, his hands were shaking. "It's not what it does," he said softly. "It's what it starts." Just then, the studio lights flickered again, brighter this time, and when the screen came back to life, the woman was gone. The man in the black coat now stood alone, his expression still unreadable, though something in his posture had changed. His head tilted slightly, almost in amusement, as if to say, "Too late." But Sundar wasn't looking at him anymore. His eyes were fixed on something else, a small symbol that had appeared in the corner of the screen, a crown. 2 keys crossed beneath it. The same seal that had been pressed into the first letter. He grabbed the beacon, clenched it tight in his fist, and turned to the host. "This was never supposed to happen here," he said quietly. "They warned me. They told me to walk softly. But the truth is, no matter how softly you walk, the ground still feels you coming." Then he looked into the camera, and though his voice was steady, his eyes betrayed the storm inside him. "If you're watching this," he said, "know that what happens next is not about me. It's about all of you. And when the history books are written, they'll say I broke everything. But the truth is, I'm trying to save you." And with that, he pressed the beacon. The lights in the studio went out instantly, plunging everything into darkness. The only sound was the sharp hiss of static from the screens and the nervous whispers of the audience. And then, from somewhere far above came the low hum of helicopters. A faint vibration traveled through the floor. Distant sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder by the second. Someone in the back of the room shouted, "What's happening?" But Sundar didn't answer. He was already moving, slipping between rows of stunned onlookers, heading toward the backstage exit. The host finally managed to stand, her heels clattering against the floor as she ran after him. "Where are you going?" she demanded, her voice rising over the noise. He stopped just long enough to glance back at her, and in that moment his face softened, just enough to remind her of the man who once spoke so gently about kindness and humility. To finish this, he said. Then he was gone. Outside the studio, the night was alive with chaos. Floodlights swept across the sky. Armored vehicles blocked the streets. Men in dark uniforms poured out of black vans, their boots hammering the pavement. Sundar moved quickly, slipping down an alley, weaving through the shadows. He didn't have much time. He knew that now, somewhere out there, maybe in a quiet room beneath the Vatican, maybe in a warehouse halfway around the world, the woman was waiting. And if he didn't reach her before the man in the black coat did, everything he'd sacrificed would be meaningless. He ducked into an abandoned building, his breath ragged, his mind racing. He thought of the names on the list, all those strangers he'd promised to protect, even if it meant destroying himself. He thought of the little boy he used to be, standing in the dust, refusing to run. And he thought of Robert Prevost, the man who wore humility like armor, who smiled with kind eyes even as he handed Sundar a choice too heavy to carry. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, a phone buzzed. He followed the sound, heart hammering at his chest, until he found it. A simple flip phone sitting atop a cracked windowsill, its screen glowing faintly. He opened it, pressed it to his ear, and there it was. The voice he'd been waiting for. Calm, measured, familiar. "You've made your choice." The voice said it was Robert Prevost. "Yes," Sundar said quietly. There was a pause. Then, "Good," the voice replied. "Now it begins." And then the line went dead. In the stillness of the dark room, Sundar lowered the phone, staring at nothing. Outside, the sound of helicopters and sirens grew louder, closer. He knew what he had to do now, but what he didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that someone else was already waiting for him. In the shadows of the room, a faint sound behind him. The whisper of fabric. He turned just in time to see the flash of steel. And before he could even raise his hands, the man in the black coat stepped out of the darkness, the silver knife catching the faint moonlight. Their eyes locked, and the man spoke at last. "You should have walked softly, Sundar," he said. Asterisk the knife and the bowed blade glinted in the dark like a fragment of moonlight. And for a breathless moment, Sundar could not move. The man in the black coat stood only a few feet away now, his gloved hand steady, his face still hidden beneath the shadows of his collar. Though the room was silent, Sundar thought he could almost hear the faint rhythm of the man's breath, slow, measured, as though this moment had been rehearsed many times before. The air smelled faintly of dust and rain, and the faint hum of the city beyond the cracked windows felt impossibly far away. Sundar's chest tightened. He had seen that blade before, in the chapel, gleaming faintly at the man's side. In the photograph, caught by accident in the corner. In his dreams since Rome, a thin silver crescent chasing him through the dark. The man stepped closer. "You shouldn't have pressed the beacon," he said, his voice calm, with a strange courtesy that only made it more chilling. "You forced their hand, and now you forced mine." Sundar's back met the cold wall behind him, and instinctively, He raised his hands, though he knew it wouldn't stop what was coming. His voice cracked slightly when he finally spoke. You don't have to do this, he said. The man tilted his head, his grip tightening slightly on the handle of the knife. Don't I? He replied softly. Then he moved. The knife flashed forward. A quick, precise arc, but Sundar ducked at the last possible second. The blade sliced into the wall where his shoulder had been, sending a sharp hiss of dust into the air. He shoved hard against the man's chest, throwing him off balance just enough to scramble toward the door. But the man was faster. Before Sundar could reach the threshold, a heavy hand clamped down his shoulder and spun him around. This time, the blade stopped just shy of his throat. He froze, feeling the cold tip press against the thin skin beneath his jaw. The man's face was close now, and for the first time, Sundar saw his eyes. They were familiar, dark, intelligent, not cruel, but impossibly heavy with something like sorrow. You don't even know who she is, do you? The man murmured. You've been running toward her since Rome, throwing away your name, your dignity, your peace, but you never stopped to ask who she really is, why she matters. Sundar swallowed hard, though the blade made even that feel dangerous. She's innocent, he said quietly. That's enough. A faint, humorless smile crossed the man's lips. No one in this story is innocent, he replied. Not you. Not even her. He stepped back then, just slightly, lowering the knife, but keeping it in his hand. His voice was softer when he spoke again. You don't understand, Sundar. You're playing a game she started long before you ever got that first letter. Sundar's knees felt weak. He tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. What are you talking about? He managed to whisper. The man sighed and finally sheathed the blade inside his coat. He turned away, walking to the cracked window. The rain outside had grown heavier now, streaking the glass in silver lines. Do you even know what she was doing in New York? He asked. She was running from you, Sundar said, though even as he spoke, doubt crept into his voice. The man shook his head slowly. She wasn't running from me, he said. She was running from him. A chill ran down Sundar's spine. Him. The man turned his head just enough that Sundar could see his profile, sharp and tired. In the faint light, Robert Prevost, the man said. The name hung in the air like a curse. For a long moment, Sundar couldn't speak. He tried to picture it, the gentle smile in the chapel, the quiet humility in his eyes, the soft way he had asked Sundar to choose between respect and kindness. But the pieces no longer fit. That's not possible, Sundar said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. The man's faint smile deepened, though it was full of sadness. You still think he chose you because of what's good in you, he said quietly. But he chose you because of what's broken, because you were willing to kneel, to let the world despise you without asking why, because you would never question the story he told you. Sundar felt as though the floor beneath him was beginning to crack. Why would he threaten her? Threaten me? What does he want? The man finally turned fully toward him, and his answer was as cold and steady as the knife he still carried. Control, he said simply. He always wanted control, and he knew the fastest way to control you was to make you believe you were saving her. Outside, the sirens grew closer. A helicopter's searchlight swept across the building for a moment, then moved on. The city felt alive now, restless and watching. Man stepped closer again, lowering his voice to a whisper. Listen to me, Sundar. This doesn't end the way you think. If you really want to save her, if you really want to stop him, you need to stop chasing the story he gave you and start finding the truth. Sundar's hands clenched into fists. Something hot and bitter welled up inside him. Anger, confusion, shame, and he shook his head. Then tell me, he said through his teeth. Tell me the truth. The man's eyes narrowed. She isn't just some innocent mother, he said. She isn't his victim. She's his apprentice, his weapon. She's the one who delivered the first letter to your office. She's the one who led you here. For a moment, Sundar couldn't breathe. That's a lie? He whispered. The man simply handed him something, a small, folded photograph, worn at the edges. Sundar hesitated before opening it, and when he did, his stomach dropped. It was her, the woman, standing in the chapel in Rome, smiling faintly, with Robert Prevost's hand resting gently on her shoulder. The man in the coat spoke one final time, his voice quieter than ever now. If you want to live long enough to choose your own side, he said, you'll stop running toward her and start running away. He turned then, disappearing into the shadows as though he'd never been there. Sundar stood alone in the dark, staring at the photograph in his trembling hands. The storm outside roared louder. The faint thud of boots on the street below told him time was running out, but his mind was no longer on the city or the sirens or even the knife. It was on the chapel, on the smile in her eyes in the photograph, and on one simple, impossible question that refused to leave him. If she was never the victim, then who was? Just then, his phone buzzed in his pocket, a single message lighting up the screen. He pulled it out, staring at the words glowing back at him in that same careful handwriting. Midnight, Vatican. You still have time. He looked up through the cracked window at the restless lights of the city, and though his body was shaking, he took a long breath, straightened his shoulders, and whispered to himself, then I'll find you. Somewhere far away in the quiet stone corridors of the Vatican, Robert Prevost sat at a great oak desk. His fingers steepled, his eyes half closed. He murmured softly to no one, You've finally woken up. And then, very gently, he smiled. Asterisk, the storm in Ramastorm began before Sundar even landed. From the airplane window, the world below looked like a dark canvas streaked with silver lightning. The clouds boiled over the Italian countryside, swallowing every trace of moonlight. The closer they got to Rome, the worse it became. Sheets of rain hammering the fuselage, winds rattling the cabin. A sense of something heavy and inevitable pressing down on everything. Sundar sat in silence, his seatbelt tight, his hands gripping the edge of the tray table. Outside, between flashes of lightning, he caught glimpses of ancient hills and quiet stone villages, all of it shrouded in shadow. It felt as if the entire city was holding its breath, waiting for him. He didn't sleep, he didn't eat. He only stared at the photograph still tucked in his pocket, the woman and Robert Prevost standing together in the chapel. Her faint smile sharp enough now to feel like a knife. Asterisk, when the plane finally touched down, the storm showed no sign of letting up. Water streamed down the windows, and the runway glowed like black glass under the floodlights. He stepped out into the rain, without an umbrella, the cold soaking through his suit in seconds. But he didn't care. Asterisk. He had until midnight. The car waiting for him was black and unmarked, its driver silent and expressionless. Sundar slid into the back seat, his wet hair clinging to his forehead, and shut the door. The driver glanced at him briefly through the rearview mirror. Vatican? He asked in a quiet Italian accent. Sundar hesitated only a moment before nodding. The car pulled away, tires hissing over the slick cobblestones. Rome at night was a maze of light and shadow, narrow streets lit by yellow lamps, fountains spilling quietly into their basins, stray cats slipping between columns. But tonight, even the beauty of the city seemed muted, swallowed by the storm. Every corner seemed to hold a whisper, every darkened doorway a pair of watching eyes as they neared the Vatican walls. Sundar felt a strange weight settle in his chest. The great dome of St. Peter's loomed above the city like an enormous shadow, its cross cutting through the clouds. Flashes of lightning revealed the faint outlines of guards along the walls, their rifles gleaming under their cloaks. The car stopped just outside the gates. The driver turned to him, finally breaking the silence. Good luck, he said simply, and then drove away, leaving Sundar standing alone in the rain. The gates were open. He walked through them slowly, his shoes slick on the wet stone, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the storm. He passed through the great square, past the silent fountains and empty chairs left from the last papal audience. And as he reached the massive bronze doors, they creaked open before he could touch them. Waiting for him in the entryway was a young priest in plain black robes, his face pale but calm. He's expecting you, the priest said. Sundar followed him down a long corridor lined with marble and candlelight. The walls were covered in tapestries and portraits of popes long dead. their eyes watching him as he passed. He felt their judgment in every stare. Centuries of men who'd all worn the same crown, who'd all made impossible choices. At last, the priest stopped before a small wooden door. He glanced back at Sundar, his expression unreadable. "He's inside," he said softly, then bowed and walked away. Sundar stood there for a moment, his heart pounding, his breath shallow. Then he pushed the door open. The room beyond was small and dim, lit only by a few flickering candles. It smelled of old wood and incense. At the far end, seated at a heavy oak desk, was Robert Prevost. He wore simple white robes, his hands folded neatly on the table in front of him. His face was calm, even kind, but his eyes were sharper than Sundar remembered, glittering in the candlelight like shards of glass. "You made it?" he said, his voice low and even. "I was beginning to wonder if you would." Sundar stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The sound echoed through the room like a final verdict. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice steady despite the storm in his chest. Robert raised an eyebrow, tilting his head slightly. "She? Don't play with me," Sundar snapped, taking a step closer. "Where is she?" Robert leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. "You've come all this way," he said, "risked everything. For a woman you don't even understand. Do you even know what she's done?" "You're the one who's been using her," Sundar shot back. "You threatened her." "You threatened me? You made me choose between her life and my own name. All this, the letters, the photographs, it was all you." Robert's faint smile deepened. "No," he said quietly. "It was her." Sundar froze. "What are you talking about?" Rose slowly from his chair, the candlelight catching the edges of his robes. He moved to a tall bookshelf along the wall and pulled down a thin, leather-bound folder. He set it on the desk and laid it toward Sundar. "Open it," he said. Sundar hesitated before reaching out. His fingers trembled as he flipped it open. Inside were pages of photographs, documents, reports, all of them bearing the same seal he'd seen before, the crown and cross keys. But the woman's face appeared again and again in different cities under different names, always just behind the scenes. In some photos, she was slipping envelopes to men in suits. In others, she was standing beside political leaders, her expression unreadable. In one, she was walking out of a building just as it exploded behind her. "She was my student," Robert said softly, watching Sundar's face. "She was supposed to succeed me. She was brilliant, disciplined, ruthless, invisible. But she wanted more. She stopped believing in the work. She started running her own games." Sundar felt the ground tilt beneath him, his hands tightening on the folder. "She played you," Robert continued. "Just like she played me. She wanted to control the machines you built, the ones that shape elections, economies, wars. She thought if she could make you doubt yourself, make you kneel, she could take everything while we tore each other apart." Sundar's breath came faster now. "Then why use me at all?" he asked hoarsely. Robert's eyes narrowed in four. The first time his voice hardened. "Because you're still her leverage," he said. "You're the reason she hasn't finished this yet. She still thinks you'll come for her. She's waiting right now to see if you'll walk through that final door and save her one last time." Lightning flashed outside, illuminating the room in stark white for a heartbeat. The storm raged louder than ever. Sundar swallowed hard, his mind a blur of memories. The chapel, the street corner, the studio, her tearful eyes on the screen. "Where is she?" he asked again, softer now. Robert's lips curled into the faintest smile. "You already know," he said, as if on cue. The door at the far end of the room, a door Sundar hadn't noticed before, creaked open. Beyond, it was only darkness. And in the darkness, the faint outline of a figure. She stepped forward slowly, her dress black, her hair wet from the rain, her eyes catching the candlelight like tiny embers. "You took your time," she said softly, her voice carrying both accusation and relief. Sundar stared at her, his pulse hammering in his ears. "Why?" he whispered. She tilted her head, and for the first time she smiled, not the faint, Helpless smile, he remembered, but something sharper. Because, she said, you were the only one who believed I needed saving. Behind him, Robert's voice came again, quiet, but cutting. Make your choice, Sundar. This time, you know it's real. And there he stood, between two storms, both of them waiting for him to move Dot in front of him, the woman he'd crossed. Oceans to save Dot behind him. The man who'd taught him humility and broken him to build something stronger. The air was electric. The candles flickered wildly. And in that breathless moment, the clock on the wall struck midnight. Dot asterisk the midnight choices. Clock struck midnight. And the chime rang through the quiet stone room like a hammer against glass. It was a deep, resonant sound, heavy with finality. And as its echo faded, the storm outside seemed to hush for just a moment. As though even the rain was waiting for what came next, Sundar stood perfectly still, his chest tight, his mind a chaos of memory and doubt. Before him, she stood in the doorway, her dark dress clinging to her shoulders, her eyes catching the candlelight with something between fire and ice. Behind him, Robert waited at the desk, his white robes glowing faintly in the flickering light, his expression calm but unreadable. Both of them watched him. Both of them silent now, and he understood, in a way he hadn't until this instant, that this had always been about this moment, this impossible, cruel moment when he would have to decide who to believe, who to betray, and who to become. Turned first to Robert, forcing his voice to stay level, though his hands trembled faintly at his sides. You lied to me, he said. Robert, single quotes, his gaze didn't waver. He didn't deny it. Yes, Robert admitted quietly. I lied. I used you. I frightened you into obedience. I forced you to your knees. But I did it because I believed and still believe that the things we protect are worth the weight of our sins. Sundar's jaw tightened. You threatened her, he said. Robert inclined his head faintly, as if granting the point. I did, he said simply. Because she is dangerous. Sundar turned slowly toward her now. Her expression hadn't changed, but there was something in her eyes, a subtle sharpness, a faint glint of triumph that he hadn't noticed before. And you, he said to her, his voice lower now, almost a whisper, you let me believe you were a victim. You let me carry you in my thoughts like something fragile, but you were what exactly? What are you really? She stepped fully into the room, her movements graceful, deliberate. I'm the one who chose not to kneel, she said softly. Her words hung in the air like smoke. He wanted me to inherit his throne. She continued, her eyes flicking briefly. To Robert, he wanted me to wear the crown he wears now. To spend my life guarding the secrets of this place, keeping the world in line with fear and quiet violence. But I saw it for what it was, a cage. So I left. She took another step closer, and now her voice was more forceful. Her eyes locked on Sundar's. You think he's humble, she said. You think he wears white because he's pure? But under those robes, he's built an empire of silence and shadows. He made you choose between respect and kindness because he wanted you broken enough to follow him without question. Sundar's breath quickened. Both of them spoke with such certainty, such conviction, and yet their stories cut in opposite directions, leaving him standing in the center of a battlefield made entirely of words and memory. The clock ticked on. Outside, thunder rolled through. The hills. He closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to remember.